Marxian Value Reconsidered by Thomas Sowell, published in 1963 in the journal Economica. While it is increasingly recognized that Marx's value theory was not a theory of prices, there still seems to be some doubt as to its real meaning and its role in the general framework of Marx's economic analysis. Some have conjectured that it was an attempt to establish an index of output, and others that it was simply a propaganda device for picturing labor as, quote, exploited, unquote. Neither of these conjectures will stand up to scrutiny. Value measured by labor time is one of the worst possible indices of output, especially in a system such as Marx's, where labor saving innovations are emphasized. It permits such paradoxical results as falling wages in value terms, purchasing a growing mass of commodities. This forced both Marx and Ricardo to distinguish between quantity and value in intertemporal comparisons, indicating that the difficulty was not only present but recognized. As for the exploitation of labor, this is not exploitation in the sense of underpayment of a factor of production for its contribution to output. Marxian exploitation is the exploitation of man by man, not of one factor of production by another. There is no real issue of the relative contributions of labor and capital in the Marxian system, which argues precisely that capital itself is created by labor and therefore is not to be regarded as a contribution of its legal proprietor at all. There is in Marx a certain definitional sleight of hand by which output per unit of labor is made to appear as labor's output, but this proves to have little effect on Marxian economics as economics. The whole of the Marxian argument could be recast in terms of marginal productivity without doing violence to the analytic content of either system, whatever the effect on moral overtones. It is sometimes claimed that Marx thought commodities ought to exchange in proportion to the labor expended on them, and that this would or should be done in the socialist society of the future. This scheme, which had deep roots in the general socialist tradition of the 19th century, was repeatedly denounced by Marx and Engels in the polemics against Gray, Ray, Proudhon, and Robertus. The quote, determination of value by labor time, unquote, was not for Marx, quote, the regenerating principle of the future, unquote, but, quote, merely the scientific expression of the economic realities of present day society, end of quote. Section 1 Economics. Marx, like many other economists, had his own definition of economics. In his case, however, an understanding of his conception of the subject is necessary for an understanding of his substantive propositions. Economics, for Marx, was not the study of relationships among interpersonal magnitudes such as profit, output prices, etc., but the study of the relationships between human beings in the productive aspect of life. It is the human agents in their mutual relations which constitutes the economic structure of society. Value as human labor and surplus value as the excess of that labor over its own maintenance requirements were constructs employed in this sort of analysis. Though Marx recognized that they were not observable magnitudes in the marketplace, as for example were exchange value, that is price, and profit. The empirical magnitudes with which conventional economics occupied itself were, in Marx's Hegelian terminology, mere appearances, systems of an underlying reality which must be investigated in different terms. References to prices and profits as the form, appearance, or phenomena expressing the underlying social reality of value and surplus value are scattered throughout Marx's writings. The one set of concepts represents, according to Marx, the invisible and unknown essence, while the other represents the phenomena which show themselves on the surface. The approach to economics, which focused on the social relations of production on the one hand and that which was focused on market phenomena on the other were dubbed respectively classical economics and vulgar economics by Marx. While Marx considered the former the more fundamental inquiry, he did not entirely dismiss the latter. He did, however, insist that the two kinds of analysis be kept separate at all times. His methodological criticism of classical economics was that it had tended to confound the categories and definitions appropriate to the social relations and those appropriate to the market relations. It had made a regular hash of these fundamentally different conceptions, Marx claimed. David Ricardo was accused of directly identifying value with price and surplus value with profit. Marx also found Adam Smith prone to similar methodological sins. Quote, these two models of approach in Adam Smith's work not only run unconstrainedly side by side, but are interwoven and continuously contradict each other. The one penetrating to the inner relations, the physiology, as it were, of the bourgeoisie system, the other only describing, cataloging, expounding, and bringing under classifying definitions the external phenomena of the process of everyday life in their outward manifestation and appearance. End of quote. Marx did not go into specifics on this point. However, it can be seen that Smithian value and real wages, for example, are initially defined in senses relevant to a sort of economic sociology. Value as human cost, and real wages and other revenues as the recipient's title to a quantity of his fellow man's labor. But these definitions give way to, or alternate with, definitions more in keeping with modern economic usage: value as price, and real wages as goods and services. Moreover, throughout the classical period, from Adam Smith through John Stuart Mill, categories of class income distribution did double duty as categories of factor returns. Rent, for example, was at times the return to different natural productivities of intramarginal land, and at other times, without notice, simply the revenue of landlords, including, of course, the return on investment in agricultural improvements. Marxian analysis, like modern economics, insisted on a sharper distinction here, but unlike modern economists, he did not make factor returns, allocational efficiency, etc., the central focus of his reasoning. Marx was in a paradoxically conservative role in clinging to the older classical questions, though he found their answers faulty. He was certainly not concerned in the slightest with making capitalism work more efficiently. It is hard to imagine that he would have spent 20 years in the British Museum for that purpose. And he also studiously avoided providing recipes for the operation of a socialist economy. The question of the contributions and rewards of classes was, however, much more in keeping with his overall concern. This question, to be meaningful, had to be in human terms: the contribution of capitalists and laborers rather than of capital and labor, and not in terms of the artifacts of the system which was itself on trial. The marginalist answer to Marx was largely irrelevant for this reason, whereas, for example, the Schumpeterian system, in which the entrepreneur personally contributes to economic progress, met Marx on his own ground. In his emphasis on that aspect of the classical tradition which was in keeping with his own interest, Marx tended to read some of his own views back into the classical economists. Thus, for example, Ricardo's definition of the value of wages in relative terms was taken by Marx as an indication of the underlying social philosophy stressing the relative positions of social classes, but when in fact Ricardo meant nothing of the sort. But for present purposes, the accuracy of Marx's interpretation of the classical tradition is less important than the nature of that interpretation, its relevance for understanding the structure of Marxian concepts, and more specifically, its influence on the organization of Das Kapital, also known simply as capital. Marx deliberately separated the treatment of the social essence of capitalism from the treatment of the economic appearance or phenomena to which it gives rise. Value and surplus value make their appearance in the first volume of Capital and are the basic conceptual tools in the analysis there. Exchange value, that is, price, is treated systematically only in the third volume, where the analysis finally considers, quote, the forms of appearance which serve as the starting point in the vulgar conception, end quote. Only in the third volume does the analysis approach step by step economic entities as they appear, quote, in their mutual interactions in competition and in the ordinary consciousness of the human agencies in this process, end quote. It was, in short, only from the third volume onwards, theories of surplus value being intended as the final volume, that Marx dealt systematically with economics. One minor but revealing symptom of the shift in the frame references is the fact that interest, which was dismissed in passing in Volume 1 as, quote, a mere fragment of surplus value, end of quote, was treated at length as an economic variable in Volume 3. While there was a drastic shift in point of view from Volume 1 to Volume 3, there was no corresponding change of mind on Marx's part, as it is sometimes alleged. Marx outlined the whole organizational structure of capital to Engels in the 1860s and followed it completely. He had worked out the relationship between value and prices, the so-called transformation problem, at least 5 years before publication of the first volume of Capital, as evidenced by a letter explaining it to Friedrich Engels in 1862. Despite superficial resemblances to Ricardian value theory, in Marxian economics, there was only what Marx himself called a quote, concept of value, unquote, and a definition of value, but not a labor theory of value. Marxian value was a construct similar to the Keynesian wage unit, both in analytic content and in substantive meaning. As it will be seen below, Marx was flabbergasted when a critic expected him to prove the concept of value. The Ricardian value theory, as Schumpeter observed, quote, forms no part of Marx's teaching, end of quote, though its suggestive role is scarcely deniable. While Marx characteristically charged bad faith to a critic who, quote, attempts to burden me with all Ricardo's limitations, end of quote, he was himself in part to blame for misunderstandings. Engels had pointed out to him in advance how the vulgar economist would interpret the first volume of Capital, but Marx insisted that, quote, this matter can be set forth only in the third book, end of quote, after an elaboration of capital turnover and related problems in Volume 2. He, Marx, said, quote, if I were to silence all such objections in advance, I should ruin the whole dialectical method of development. On the contrary, this method has the advantage of continually setting traps these fellows which provoke them to untimely demonstrations of their asininity. End of quote. By dialectical, in this instance, Marx presumably meant the systematic development of analysis from essence to appearance. He apparently expected to crush his critics when the second and third volumes appeared within a year or two according to his schedule. He did not foresee the long delay before their eventual posthumous publication and the marginalist revolution which would be completed by then. William Stanley Jevons, in fact, died a year before Marx. The most important effect of this delay of a quarter of a century between publication of Volume 1 and Volume 3 of Capital was that it provided ample time for Marx's followers and his marginalist critics to join the battle and harden their positions on the false issue of a labor theory of value. Section 2. The Law of Value. The Marxian law of value was explicitly a law of allocation of labor reduced to homogeneous wage units by society at large. The law of value determines how much of its disposable working time society can expend on each particular class of commodities. Engels observed, somewhat condescendingly, that the, quote, law of value brings about the only organization and arrangement of social production which is possible in the circumstances, end of quote. i.e., under capitalism, the law of value, according to Marx, quote, enforces itself not with reference to individual commodities or articles, but to the total products of the particular social spheres of production, end quote. In short, Marxian law of value was not a law of correspondence between definitional values and empirical prices, but on the contrary, asserted that the two must differ, primarily because of the disequilibrium inherent in an unplanned economic system, and secondarily because of equilibrium differences between prices and values. Marx criticized Ricardo for focusing on the latter, more superficial of the two kinds of deviations of price from value. The law of value serves to, quote, maintain the social equilibrium of production and the turmoil of its accidental fluctuations, end of quote. Price movements in these equilibrium are its mode of operation. Quote, magnitude of value expresses a relation of social production. It expresses the connection that necessarily exists between a certain article and the portion of the total labor time of society required to produce it. The possibility, therefore, quantitative incongruity between price and the magnitude of value, or the deviation of the former from the latter, is inherent in the price form itself. There is no defect, but on the contrary, admirably adapts the price form to a mode of production whose inherent flaws impose themselves only as a mean of apparently lawless irregularities that compensate one another. End of quote. This was said, it should be noted, early in the first volume of Capital. The Marxian law of value is an example of the Hegelian notion of a general necessity asserting itself in the pattern of particular accidents. Marx's phrasing repeatedly suggests this origin. Quote, the a priori system in which the division of labor within the workshop is regularly carried out becomes in the division of labor within society an a posteriori nature imposed necessity, controlling the lawless caprice of the producers and perceptible in the barometrical fluctuations of the market prices. End quote. The same idea recurs in Marx's bitter reaction to criticism of his discussion of value in the first volume of Capital. Quote, the nonsense about the necessity of proving the concept of value arises from complete ignorance of the subject dealt with and of the method of science. This necessity of distributing social labor in definite proportions cannot be done away with. The science consists precisely in working out how the law of value operates, so that if one wanted at the very beginning to explain that law, one would have to give the science before the science. Get it? It's precisely Ricardo's mistake in his first chapter on value. The vulgar economist has not the faintest idea that the actual everyday exchange relations need not be directly identical with the magnitude of value. The point of bourgeois society consists precisely in this, that a priori there is no conscious social regulation of production. End of quote. The allocation role of price movements was the basis of Marx's uncompromising opposition to all socialist schemes for establishing the labor values of goods by government fiat. In the Marxian system, it was not the labor actually expended, concrete, qualitative individual labor, which constituted labor, but the labor which should be expended, abstract, quantitative, social labor, given both technical conditions and the demand for the commodity. Marxian socially necessary labor was not a mere technological concept as often assumed. For Marx, the quote, socially necessary labor time is the labor time which is required for the satisfaction of the social need, the demand, end of quote. For example, quote, suppose that every piece of linen in the market contains no more labor time than is socially necessary. In spite of this, all these pieces taken as a whole may have had superfluous labor time spent on them. End of quote. If there is optimal equilibrium allocation, quote, then the products of the various groups are sold at their values or at prices which are modifications of the values or prices of production due to general laws. End of quote. These modifications have both lodged in the literature on Marxian economics, primarily because of their importance from the point of view of some kind of price theory criticism exemplified by Bombavrick. Rather than because of their intrinsic relevance to the argument actually advanced by Marx. The Marxian law of value focused attention on the allocational mechanism at work in otherwise uncoordinated capitalism, with emphasis on the possibilities of misallocation, quote, since a balance is an accident under the crude conditions of its production, end of quote. His production schemes in the second volume of Capital were illustrations of the intricate adjustments necessary for equilibrium, even under highly simplified conditions. All of this had obvious relevance to the socialist alternative in the near background. It also had relevance to another feature of capitalism emphasized by Marx, recurrent depressions, or as he put them, crises. Section 3, Prices and Crises. Price fluctuations were important in the Marxian system, not only because of their allocational role, but because the constant necessity of price fluctuation introduced the constant possibility of violent price fluctuations, leading to sporadic economic crises and depressions. Quote, violent fluctuations of price cause interruptions, great collisions, or even catastrophes in the process of reproduction. End of quote. While there are tendencies of the various sectors of the economy toward equilibrium by the competitive process, quote, the continuity of this process itself equally presupposes the constant disproportion, which it has continuously, often violently, to even out. End of quote. In 1847, Marx set forth the germ of the idea which he was to develop more than 20 years later in Capital. Quote, the economists say that the average price of commodities is equal to the cost of production. That this is a law, the anarchical movement in which rise is compensated by fall and fall by rise is regarded by them as chance. With just as much right, one could regard the fluctuations as the law and the determination by the cost of production as chance. It is solely these fluctuations which, looked at more closely, bring with them the most fearful devastations, and, like earthquakes, cause bourgeois society to tremble to its foundations. End of quote. This was one of the many areas in which Marx thought remained unchanged from his early years to the end of his life. Even the assertion that it was solely price fluctuations which precipitated crises remained a part of Marx's theory of economic downturns, which was entirely a theory of disproportionality. Under static conditions, it might be expected that price oscillations would settle down to the cost of production, but Marx saw capitalism as inherently dynamic, with irregularly declining costs of production among the various commodities and shifting proportions within the growing mass of output. In earlier periods, a more stable output was geared to a more or less known demand. But now, according to Marx, an ever increasing supply was dumped on the market in anticipation of raising demand. The opportunity for miscalculation was growing along with output. In Marx's theory of crisis, he had no theory of the business cycle as a whole. It was fixed contractual obligations which enabled disproportionality and attendant price fluctuations to precipitate crises. Overproducing firms or industries find profits declining below anticipated levels, while, quote, fixed charges remain the same and in part cannot be paid. Hence, crisis. End of quote. This was not to say that any departure from equilibrium would produce a crisis. Some indefinitely defined magnitude of shock to the system was necessary, in order to produce a sufficient disturbance of confidence, scramble for liquidity, and a monetary contraction. At a given moment, the supply of all commodities may be greater than the demand for all commodities, because the demand for the general commodity, money, exchange value, is greater than the demand for all particular commodities. Once the crisis is underway, even those sectors of the economy which had not been guilty of overproducing, quote, are now suddenly in relative overproduction because the means to buy them and therewith the demand for them have contracted. Even if there's been no overproduction in these spheres, now they are overproducing. End of quote. Thus, quote, in times of general overproduction, the overproduction in some spheres is always the result, the consequence of overproduction in the leading articles of commerce. End of quote. Marx never advanced the crude theory that too much of everything was produced. He used the term overproduction somewhat freely, perhaps to emphasize his differences to be discussed below with the underconsumptionists. However, this overproduction was in reality only disproportionate production. Quote, if production were proportionate, there would be no overproduction. End of quote. While in analytic essence, this is simply a restatement of the classical view that production is not excessive in the aggregate, but only maladjusted in its internal proportions. Marx did not, like the classical economists, treat this disproportionality as an adventitious consequence of governmental interference or of reconversion from war to peace. Rather, it was regarded as inherent in a constantly growing capitalist economy, which would never allow the respective equilibrium quantities of commodities to be discovered by producers. Overproduction and underconsumption were not simply different names for the same thing. In the senses in which Marx used these terms, Marx's discussion of overconsumption referred to what might be called a socialist version of underconsumption, the fact that workers were not paid enough to purchase the total national output. While this fact was acknowledged by socialists and non-socialists alike, it linked up with the socialist concept, not theory, of exploitation, and issued as the assertion that the worker was not paid enough to buy back what he had produced, the latter being defined as his average product rather than his marginal product. While the essentially sociological first volume of Capital developed this traditional socialist concept of exploitation, this idea played a very peripheral role in Marx's purely economic analysis, though it accounts for certain isolated Marxian phrases which have provided a tenuous basis for assuming Marx to be an underconsumptionist, a forerunner of Keynes, and a believer in the economic breakdown of capitalism. Marx was uncompromisingly opposed to the idea that underconsumption was the precipitating factor in crises. Quote, it is purely a tautology to say that crises are caused by a scarcity of solvent consumers or of a paying consumption. If any commodities are unsaleable, it means that no solvent consumers have been found for them. But if one were to attempt to clothe this tautology with a semblance of a profound justification by saying that the working class receive too small a portion of their own product, and the evil would be remedied by giving them a larger share of it, or raising their wages, we should reply that crises are precisely always preceded by a period in which wages rise generally and the working class actually get a larger share of the annual product intended for consumption. From the point of view of the advocates of simple common sense, such a period should rather remove prices. End of quote. Engels also declared in his Antidurching, written close collaboration with Marx, quote, the underconsumption of the masses has existed as long as there have been exploiting and exploited classes. Therefore, While underconsumption has been a constant factor in history for thousands of years, the general shrinkage of the market, which breaks out in crisis as the result of a surplus of production, is a phenomenon only of the last 50 or so years. End quote. The surplus of production referred to was a surplus in particular industries, since it was monetary contraction. Quote, the general shrinkage of the market, unquote, which precipitated downturns. There was no general overproduction in the Marxian system. Quote, there would be no overproduction at one point if overproduction took place at all points in equal degree. End of quote. But this cannot happen because at any given time, quote, capitalistic production is only able to let itself go without restraint in certain spheres in definite conditions, end of quote. It cannot, quote, develop in all spheres simultaneously and in equal degree, end of quote. Apparently, this was meant as a historical generalization. No reason was given why it should be so. Again, Marx essentially endorsed the classical view that there could be no general overproduction. His sweeping attacks on Say's law differed little, if at all, analytically, from John Stuart Mill's steadfast defense of it. Points conceded in passing by one was simply treated as being the heart of the matter by the other. Each denied that too much of everything could be produced, and each affirmed that monetary contraction could cause a temporary deficit demand. Marx repeatedly argued, in opposition to the underconsumptionists, the consumption trends to increase in the period immediately preceding a crisis. Yet he also asserted that, quote, the last cause of all real crises always remains the poverty and restricted consumption of the masses, end of quote. The apparent contradiction is explained by a difference in the frame of reference of the two statements. Although underconsumption in the socialist sense was not considered to be the precipitating factor in crises, it was considered to be part of the institutional framework which made crises possible. Quote, if overproduction could only occur after all members of the nation had satisfied even the most essential needs, in the history of bourgeois society up to the present, not only no general overproduction, but even no partial overproduction could have occurred. End of quote. The point of view here is no longer someone theorizing as to causal sequences, but of someone philosophizing over the institutional constraints of capitalism, especially as they bear on the poorer classes. Substantively, the statement says only what Marx had said elsewhere, that production, quote, comes to a standstill at a point determined by the production and realization of profit, and not by the satisfaction of social needs, end of quote. In arguing that Marx was an underconsumptionist, he and Sweezy surmised that Marx would have developed an underconsumptionist theory of the downturn had he lived to complete capital himself. Sweezy declared, quote, this does not necessarily mean, however, that a decline in output must occur first in the consumption goods department. Marx's silence on this issue merely shows that he had never worked the underconsumption theory out in any details. End of quote. But Marx was not silent at all as to whether a crisis must necessarily break out in the consumption goods sector. In fact, he declared the very opposite. Quote, crises do not show themselves nor break forth first in retail business, which deals with direct consumption, but in the spheres of wholesale business and banking. End of quote. Nor is there a tenable compromise in the supposition the Marxian system involves some crisis arising from disproportionality and other crises arising from underconsumption. Underconsumption is the last cause of all crises in Marx's plainly expressed view, without being the immediate cause of any. The assumption that Marx believed in the economic breakdown of capitalism is wholly unsupported by anything in Marx's own writings. Even such scholars in this area as Sweezy and Schumpeter have been unable to cite anything in support of their breakdown interpretation except other post-Marxian literature. Thorstein Veblen pointed out more than half a century ago that there was no such theory in Marx. Apparently, latter scholars have felt no need either to cite such a theory or to revise their interpretation. Marx spoke of crises as transient and momentary phenomena. He said, quote, there are no permanent crises, end quote. Crises are important in his overall vision for their role as spurs to revolution. It is these crises that, by their periodical return, put existence of the entire bourgeois society on its trial, each time more threateningly. End of quote. Thus, Marx was able to say, with some poetic license, that capitalism destroys itself by its own internal contradictions. The word contradiction has been cited in support of the breakdown interpretation of Marxian theory, but Marx used the term contradiction in its peculiarly Hegelian sense, internal conflicting forces leading to transformation rather than impasse. Contradiction was, in Hegel's words, the very moving principle of the world. End of quote. The end. Forget about it.